Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. To monitor dangerous military activity by the United States and South Korea in real time. That is what North Korea gave as a reason behind its plan to launch its very first military reconnaissance satellite. Just today, Pyongyang announced that the launch will be in June, disclosing the timing of the launch just one day after it notified Japan that this would be sometime between May 31st and June 11th. Will Pyongyang be successful in this endeavor? And what are the other latest issues related to the regime? For an in-depth analysis, we invite Go Myong-hyun, Senior Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Go, welcome.
Good to be here.
And we also have Brian Myers, Professor at Dongseo University. Good to see you, Professor Myers.
Good to see you too.
All right, first question to our Dr. Go. Now, starting last Thursday, South Korea and the U.S. began conducting a combined joint live-fire exercise, which is the first of the kind in 6 years. Now, it is reportedly the largest one ever. Now, could you tell us why this exercise is massive?
It's about signaling to North Korea that despite North Korea's advances in the strategic weapons front, especially when it comes to the weapons of mass destruction, such as nuclear weapons, the conventional superiority in the Korean Peninsula lies with the alliance between South Korea and the United States. For that reason, this is a demonstration of firepower. So both militaries of the United States and South Korea displayed their latest and the greatest weapon systems, the conventional types, such as the multiply launched rocket system and obviously the famous K9 howitzers. And then they also demonstrated that there's a much better coordination between the unmanned, the surveillance and reconnaissance system and the firepower on the ground. So this shows a level of technological sophistication that North Korea aspires to have but doesn't yet possess. So I think in that sense has shown to the North Koreans that the South Korea and the United States are ready and in any kinds of contingencies. And this is again the re-emphasis of the superiority and deterrence effect of the alliance against North Korea.
Right, I see. Now, we do need to tap on the military reconnaissance satellite. North Korea disclosed the timing of its planned launch through state media on Tuesday, saying its first one is going to be launched in June. Now, what do you expect the satellite's capabilities to be? And what is the reason for giving notification to Japan and the IMO? I mean, is that a normal process? So
starting with the notification to Japan, clearly the launch trajectory could involve Japanese airspace. So, but then at the same time, we expect North Korea to also, and another possible trajectory for this military satellite launch could involve South Korean airspace. So I think by only notifying Japan, but not by not notifying South Korea, North Korea is sticking to its existing line of bypassing South Korea in any kind of reaching out to the international community. And at the same time, there's another intention, which is to normalize North Korea's behavior. So clearly, North Korea's space vehicle launch is a reflection of North Korea's ICBM capability, therefore forbidden by the United Nations Security Council resolution. But by notifying Japan and then claiming that this is a part of their peaceful endeavor to develop their space technology, they are trying to normalize their illicit ballistic missile technology development. So there's that effect. And then when it comes to the capability of the military satellite, clearly this is intended to essentially give more information to the North Korean planners. North Koreans have long-range ballistic missiles, but they are lacking the so-called intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. So in order to target objectives beyond the horizon, North Korea will need long-range reconnaissance capability, and the military satellites is basically the most important asset in that regard. And North Korea doesn't have that. So in that sense, North Korea's ballistic missile threat is not credible because North Korea can only target either static targets or massive targets such as urban areas, where therefore they can only use massive weapons of mass destruction. So for the North Koreans who claim to have a very high-tech and cutting-edge threat capability, meaning they have a precision-guided munitions, they need to demonstrate they have a very sophisticated real-time intelligence collection capabilities. So in that sense, North Korea can make, by successfully launching this military reconnaissance satellite, North Korea can finally perhaps convince the international community that their military capability has reached the zenith in terms of threats and as well as capability and precision. So in that sense, in terms of demonstrating to the international community that they are now a major military power, this is going to be a very important step.
Right. So in that sense, this launch is very important for North Korea right now.
Exactly.
Right. Interesting. Now, Professor Myers, in response to the North Korea's unveiling of its satellite launch plan, the U.S. State Department spokesperson on Monday said any satellite launch by Pyongyang would violate the UNSC resolutions. Now, what is the likely reaction from the international community if the launch does take place, and what could be done?
Well, there's very little that Washington or the international community can do beyond making very stern statements before and after the launch. I mean, we've seen this playing out for years now, because virtually every feasible form of economic sanction has been imposed on North Korea already, with pretty mediocre and actually diminishing results. Now, in former times, and I mean like 10 or 15 years ago, the Americans could sometimes get the UN Security Council to make a united show of disapproval, though even that was never very easy. And it's virtually impossible now, considering the open animosity that exists between the United States on one hand and China and Russia on the other. So I really don't see what America or its regional allies can do to punish North Korea for this planned launch, beyond, say, expanding the scale of joint military exercises. And things like these live fire exercises are themselves perhaps interpretable as responses to earlier missile provocations.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, staying on the satellite front, recently South Korea's locally developed Nuri rocket has successfully been launched into the space, and experts say that this Nuri rocket's success would have made North Korean leader Kim Jong-un quite uneasy. Why is this?
Well, because it's part of the North Korean propaganda that says that when it comes to the military technology and space technology, North Korea is a couple of steps ahead of South Korea, whereas it's way backward in all other fronts for obvious reasons, and which is visible to everybody. With the South Korea success with the domestic space vehicle called Nuri, it actually diminishes the impact of North Korean propaganda. I think that's the reason why North Koreans are trying to downplay the success and the significance of a South Korean domestic space program success. But at the same time, there are real concerns behind this on the part of North Korea. North Korea rightfully understands that South Korea, with the successful launch of a Nuri rocket, it has acquired very advanced space vehicle technology, which can carry not just the military surveillance satellites like the one that North Korea is trying to launch, but also it's a step before South Korea acquiring a strategic capability, such as an intercontinental ballistic missile, even though South Korea has committed to the peaceful use of space. So I think both in the propaganda front as well as in the real strategic front, North Korea sees that South Korea can easily surpass them again in the strategic weapons domain as well as in all other domains. So in that sense, Kim Jong-un probably feels very threatened by South Korea's advances.
Right. Now, Professor Myers, shifting gears a little bit here, early in May, a number of North Koreans, including 2 families, defected, marking the first such defection case involving a family group since 2017. Now, some Korean authorities are referring to them as boat people. The term originally refers to Vietnamese refugees who fled their home country by boat due to collapse of South Vietnamese government. Now, what's your view on using this term? Is it appropriate? And what does this defection suggest in your opinion?
Well, I was a university student here in South Korea in 1987 when the famous Kim Man-chul defection took place, which involved an 11-member family fleeing from North Korea in a boat and eventually landing in South Korea. And at that time, the media talked about nothing except this defection, and everybody was speculating that the event might herald a Vietnam-type wave of boat people, and no such wave ensued, and that was, 36 years ago. Now, there have been a few spectacular group defections since then, like the 13 North Korean waitresses who fled from China to South Korea in 2016, but they've been very rare. Now, I can't imagine that the tightened border controls over the past few years prevented quite a few people from running away who may now be hoping to exploit the relaxation of those controls. So I do expect an increase in defections, an uptick. But until we see significant signs of internal unrest, I would caution against expecting maritime group defections to be a frequent occurrence. And of course, that wave of Vietnamese boat people happened under very different political circumstances from the kind that we see in North Korea today.
All right, interesting. Now, Dr. Go, the unification minister himself, that he said that during the recent National Assembly's Foreign Affairs Committee meeting, that these defections are a sign of economic and other hardships that North Koreans are facing right now, especially the food shortages. Could we say this is partly a reason why North Korea has been relatively silent during, like G7 summit?
Well, I think, there are many different reasons behind North Koreans' strategic silence. But then I think when it comes to the economic situation and the diagnosis by the unification minister, I would say I agree with that diagnosis. Clearly, North Korea is undergoing serious economic hardship. I think I mentioned several times in this very place that it's not that difficult to estimate the food production shortfall in North Korea because the estimation is very accurate and then also very simple to calculate. So it's basically the multiplication of the inputs, land, fertilizers, weather, equals to output. And then we know that North Korea has been falling short in many of these different production factors. So, and it's been going on for a considerable amount of time. So clearly there are a significant number of people in North Korea who are probably suffering from serious food shortages. And then clearly this increases the chance of North Koreans trying to escape. But then at the same time, I agree with Professor Myers that this probably doesn't presage a wave of boat people, refugees from North Korea. The reason is because escaping North Korea through maritime routes, it's very costly for the North Koreans because clearly they have to have access to the transportation means, in this case, a ship or boat, and that's going to be very difficult to access for ordinary North Koreans. Clearly, the non-refugees who've been able to flee North Korea with their families in tow, they probably had a special access, meaning they have a special position in the North Korean society. And then this is another reason why North Korean government cannot claim that these people have been, for instance, kidnapped by the South Koreans, because we know that the North Koreans are only allowed to go on a maritime expedition without families, obviously, but by themselves for fishing or for other reasons, but nothing to do with that involves individual affairs. So the evidence shows that the evidence here in this case being family members indicates that this is a defection, willingly defecting to South Korea. And I think the unification minister probably was briefed on the motivations of these defectors, and then the defectors probably have indicated that the economic hardship have been the main reason for their defection.
I see. Now, Professor Myers, meanwhile, North Korea's borders have been sealed since early 2020 to contain COVID-19, but there appear to be signs that Pyongyang is slowly getting ready to reopen its doors. A recent satellite imagery shows an unusual level of aircraft maintenance, hinting at the possibility that it could soon resume international flights. Now, how do you see this?
Right. Well, according to 38 North, the Pyongyang watching group, various Air Koryo planes have been taken into maintenance hangars at the main airport, the Sunan airport, and this is not done very often. Now, when you add that information to news that China's new ambassador has finally arrived in Pyongyang after a very long wait due to the coronavirus lockdown, and we've got news that a Chinese tourist agency is preparing to resume group tours to North Korea, and of course you take into account that tourism is a good moneymaker for a regime which is, as Dr. Go just made clear, in desperate need of capital for various reasons. The usual ballpark estimate is that tourism brings in about $40 million a year. And tourists have a certain propaganda role to play inside North Korea, where they are presented to the locals as pilgrims, as great admirers of the regime. And of course, international flights would also be necessary for most forms of economic cooperation and humanitarian aid. So I do think it is likely that international flights are going to resume, but we've been hearing rumors to that extent since the beginning of this year. So I wouldn't want to say with any certainty at what time in the summer they're going to start.
Right, I see. So it is likely, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, Professor Myers, I'd like to ask you one more question. Moving on to the international politics, Japan has recently been expressing much more serious concerns over North Korea's threats. According to media outlets, the draft of the 2023 edition of Japan's Defense White Paper says North Korea's nuclear and missile development are a much more grave and imminent threat to Japan. How's Japan viewing North Korea right now?
Well, the short answer is that what Japan is saying about this grave and imminent threat is objectively correct, and it's warranted by real-world developments. North Korea is better armed than ever. Its apparent acquisition of a solid-fueled missile capability indicates that it can fire missiles at very short notice. And Japan has traditionally been not only a routine object of threatening official rhetoric from Pyongyang, but it also lies well within the range of North Korea's arsenal and has in the past seen missiles fired over its territory. So Tokyo, I think, is hardly overreacting. But if there are added strategic or political motivations in play here, I would say that the Kishida government wants to convey a sense of greater urgency, not only to Washington, but also to the Japanese people. After all, the Kishida government wants to double defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. So it naturally wants the Japanese people to support that increase.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, since our Professor Myers tapped on the political motivation, I'd like to ask you this. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said on Saturday that he's willing to meet Kim Jong-un without any preconditions to resolve this issue of Japanese nationals abducted in the 1960s to 70s. Now, is this just a political move by Kishida, and what are the chances of the two meeting each other?
Well, first of all, the Japanese government has been claiming regularly that their priority when it comes to North Korea is to bring up the issue of abductees and then have a direct face-to-face meeting with the leader of North Korea. So in that sense, Prime Minister Kishida's remarks, an offer of dialogue with North Korea, essentially is the repeat of the previous Japanese government's position in this regard. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that the timing of this offer of dialogue came at this point. I think the Japanese government understands that the North Koreans traditionally have shifted from a phase of provocation to a phase of engagement with an offer of dialogue from somewhere else. Essentially, North Koreans, given their internal situation of economic hardship and the very strong deterrence posture by the international community, not just by South Korea and the United States, but the wider international community, essentially trying to pressure North Korea to behave better. I would say even China is opposed to North Korea's much anticipated seventh nuclear test. So I think North Korea, I think the Japanese government is assessing that North Korean position is not quite favorable to North Korea's own strategic objectives. So in that sense, I think the timing is right for North Koreans to shift from a phase of a provocation that we have witnessed throughout last year to a phase of engagement like the one that we last seen back in 2018. So one Japanese government, in a way, is taking a real risk and then putting on the table an off-ramp strategy for North Korea, for North Koreans to get off this current cycle of provocation and instead engage in dialogue with whichever government outside of the Korean Peninsula. So I think in that sense, it's interesting that North Koreans reacted to this in not such a negative way. I think North Koreans see this as a possible opening for dialogue, but then we have to see whether the international community and North Korea themselves are going to invest in this opportunity.
Right, so in a way, Japan is trying to urge North Korea to change its behavior.
Well, it's urging North Korea to change its behavior, but it's putting on the table essentially an opportunity for North Koreans to change their tactic. Yeah.
Interesting. Right, Professor Myers, lastly, according to Radio Free Asia, an expert has hinted at the possibility of Choi Sun-hee, a North Korean diplomat visiting Jakarta this July for the ASEAN Regional Forum. Now, though it is just a possibility, what are the chances? And if she does take part in, what might Pyongyang be up to?
Well, North Korea is, of course, a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, as many countries are, and North Korean officials have attended several of those forums in the past, and they've been pretty useful for the regime's diplomacy at key times. It was famously on the sidelines of an ASEAN Regional Forum in 2000 that the first ministerial bilateral meeting of American and North Korean officials took place. Now, this upcoming forum in July in Indonesia could also be a useful venue at which the North Koreans could discreetly test the waters with South Korea's Yoon government. Now, in the more recent past, the North Koreans have sent relatively low-level diplomats, sort of ambassador-level diplomats, to these ASEAN regional forums. So if Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee does go to Indonesia in July, I would take that as an indication that North Korea is interested in talking either to the Americans or to the South Koreans or both, because I don't think that ASEAN affairs per se would warrant such a high-level official participating.
Right, I see. Now, I'd like to ask more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. And thank you, Dr. Go and Professor Myers, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.